Do you ever feel like you're the outsider looking in? This is a sign of childhood emotional neglect. This is Dr. Spencer Coaches. Today I'm going to talk to you about childhood emotional neglect and the symptoms of it and the impact that it has on your life. Because you could be living your whole life feeling like you don't belong, feeling like you're not good enough, and always trying to win the approval of others because you're the outsider looking in and you always want to fit in and belong, but you never feel like it, even when you're around people. I believe it was there was an actor in a movie called The Thin Red Line where the actor said, he was asked, do you ever feel alone? And he said, only when I'm around people. And it's very common if you have childhood emotional neglect to feel alone when you're around people. And this is caused by, there's an emotional response to feeling this neglect. It feels like abandonment. And if there's no nurturance, there's no empathy, there's no support, then you experience childhood emotional neglect, usually from a narcissistic parent who is abusive, putting you down, only concerned about your survival or your looks or your skill development, never about how you feel. There's no nurturance provided. You never felt safe. And that produces childhood emotional neglect. Also, an emotionally unavailable person, or even parents who aren't around. They're just simply at work all day. Or father just doesn't come home and he's only home on the weekends. That could also create childhood emotional neglect. So the essence of childhood emotional neglect is a feeling of abandonment and like you're not good enough, that nothing is ever good enough, that you feel unworthy. Your self-worth is really, really at an all-time low because your parents didn't value you. At least they didn't make you feel valued. And when parents neglect the emotional well-being, they don't make their children feel protected, they don't nurture their confidence, and they don't make them feel safe, they don't build their self-esteem, it creates a lack mentality. You always feel like there's something missing in life, and you may project it onto life and try to get things. I'll share with you a story. I was tortured when I was 4 and 5, and when I tried to tell my parents, they didn't believe me. And over time, being that my parents are first generation, they were really concerned about making it, their career and what it takes to make it, what it takes to survive in the corporate world. And that's all they talked about my whole life. Not my happiness, not my well-being, not my health, not my protection. It was all about survival and what it takes to survive in this world. And then those of you who have Asian parents or a lot of first-generation parents, your grades are never good enough. I was never smart enough. Even if I got an A, I got to get an A in every single test. I got an A in every single test. I got to get an A plus. I get an A plus. Now I got to do it every single time. If I don't do it, then there's something wrong with me. I was reprimanded for getting a B. So this academic pressure always made me feel like I was never smart enough, never good enough. And I just became very competitive with people and never really empathized with anybody. And because I didn't empathize with people, the friends whom I thought were my friends were really competition. And some of my friends caught on to it. And like, Spencer, do you care about us? Seems like you're just competing with us. Eventually, all my friends left because I never made an emotional connection with them. And that's what happens with childhood emotional neglect. I was stuck in survival and became only concerned with how I looked and my self-esteem, my reputation, my status, because that's what made me feel worthy, but it was a false sense of self-worth. It wasn't until I studied psychology and I formed some genuine bonds with people especially a Native American medicine woman, where really began to feel safe enough to open up about how I feel and what I feel. And I began to experience a sense of nurturing and empathy from other people that I never felt in my family. And that ignited something in me and ignited something. I do care about people. I do care about how people feel. And I started to develop what's called emotional intelligence. This is how you get out of childhood emotional neglect. You see, when you have these feelings of not belonging, this sense of isolation, this sense of you're the outsider looking in, it could be paralyzing. It can make you feel like everything and everyone is against you and you're not good enough to win the love or the like of others. And you only live to get liked, not be not be respected. You follow what I'm saying? And that's what happens on the internet. Everyone wants to be liked. It creates a dopamine response. It gets us a feeling of reward. But then that stress of being abandoned, because that's what it is. Childhood emotional neglect is abandonment. Let me put it this way. In the hunting and gathering days, when we lived in a tribal time, if you misbehaved, did some really terrible things, you would get kicked out of the tribe, kicked out of the village. And that often meant certain death because it was very hard to survive on your own, to live in the forest all by yourself. You had to hunt, you had to grow food, you had to build shelter, make fire, all by yourself and fend off wild animals and the weather. And more often than not, those people died of starvation. Very hard to grow anything by yourself and to hunt alone. And those that do become the lone wolf. And they become oddballs. They don't have any relationships with people. They become pure survivors. They don't tolerate anybody. They don't put up with any BS. And I'm sure you've met people like that. The Sigma male. They don't lead anybody. They don't listen to anybody. They're hard to work with. You follow what I'm saying? That's the end result. Or you're constantly in a state of admire me, admire me, admire me. Always seeking admiration because admiration is better than nothing. That's what happens with childhood emotional neglect. Doesn't mean you're a narcissist. We often have narcissistic tendencies because everybody loves to be admired. It's the strongest desire in humankind. When you only live by that and you have no empathy, you have no ability to relate and understand another person's disposition, and you only seek to get, and you become mean and abusive and condescending and manipulative, and you lie and you cheat and you steal, and then you become a narcissist or even a sociopath. But here I'm talking about the average person who walks around feeling like they don't belong their whole life. It's such a terrible feeling to be with coworkers, to go out to a social, you go out for drinks on a Friday night with your coworkers and you're sitting there all alone, not communicating, not expressing. Because in your mind, there's a subtle belief, a subconscious belief that you're not good enough and you don't belong, that you don't fit in. And it creates a lot of isolation. And that isolation can deepen and deepen and deepen all the way to depression. And when you get into depression, then life turns for the worse. And you think nobody's going to understand me because of this feeling of abandonment and not being good enough. You're not good enough to feel worthy. You're not good enough to receive nurturance. You're not good enough to have your esteem built. You're not good enough to be protected. And that's what happens. It may not be exactly in those thoughts, but it sure does feel like that. And that affects and impacts your relationships. It impacts your mental health. Depression is becoming more and more commonplace now, as well as anxiety. You get this feeling of anxiousness, always trying to win the approval of others because you want to seek admiration or a sense of acceptance. And because you don't feel safe, you don't feel protected. There's almost a sense of hypervigilance, but it's more of a sense of loneliness. and a lack of self-worth, you kind of walk around with your head down, like, and you go into the analysis paralysis. You shut your emotions down and you get stuck in your head. And you only see the world through this analytical, logical, but it's not really a rational kind of logic. It's really an irrational way of thinking, assuming things about others, that people are conspiring against you. You can develop a sense of paranoia. It can get worse than just not fitting in. Now, the average person may just feel like they never fit in. And since you're always trying to feel worthy, you may come across as desperate and needy. And nobody likes a needy person. So you can become the social outcast. Nobody wants to invite you out anymore because you're really needy. And then the isolation deepens and thickens. Now, it could lead to a sense of entitlement, because deep down inside, you know you are worth being accepted and liked and appreciated and celebrated. But it becomes like a demand. You demand it from people. So you become self-centered. And almost like you don't want to pay any other attention. It could lead to narcissistic qualities. And the secret to overcoming all of this is to build your self-worth. How do you feel about yourself? You've got to build a strong sense of feeling good by tapping into your core values of what is important to you, what matters to you. And nurture that which matters to you. What do you care about? And also nurture what brings you joy. Because what brings you pure joy, just like when you're a child, when you just saw the sunshine or played with sand or slid down a slide, that brought you pure joy and there's nothing else required. Those are your core values. And when you discover them and nurture them and protect them, you can build your own self-worth. And then in your mind, you know you matter and you don't have to keep trying to prove yourself to everyone around you. That's how you overcome childhood emotional neglect, because that's what I did. It takes a lot of mental work to find your worth, but it is possible, and it is possible to discover your true self-worth. This is Dr. Spencer Coaches. If you have any questions at all, leave a comment below and I will reply. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I sure hope this helps. Thank you so much for listening.